So how much money did our small diversified farm make over the course of 2023? Well, in today's video, I'm gonna be firing up the laptop and breaking down the numbers and get into it with you guys, so come along. Hi, Abby dog, how you doing, sweetie? Come on, Toby, let's go. Inside. I mean, I get the question all of the time when you're just one guy raising some ducks and geese and chickens and cattle and pigs and bees and trees. How much money can you reliably make in a given year? And by the end of this video, I will break it down for you line by line, business by business, to show you how much revenue, how much expense, how much profit. And so without building up the suspense anymore, let's get into it. Uh-oh, Abby's being a goofball to get attention. You just kicked the camera, girl. So over the last couple of days, I have been breaking down all of the numbers and laying this out and trying to do this in a way that makes sense for everybody. Because my goal here is to make this pretty simple and straightforward, even though a lot of these numbers are very complex. Also, just as a heads up, after I release this video, I will also put out a podcast probably a few days later that goes in depth. And so probably covers a lot of the same numbers, but goes way more into detail in terms of methodology and that sort of thing as well. But without further ado, let's get into the numbers. So to start things off for 2023, in terms of farm revenue, it was up this year and it was the highest revenue we've ever generated at $25,282, which is nothing to sneeze at. Again, that is not a gigantic number and that's not gonna be making me rich anytime soon, but I feel pretty proud of the work that I put in to produce that number. But also keep in mind that that is a revenue number, not a profit number. Also, probably both my lawyer and my accountant would like me to say that
number one, this is not the full financial picture for Goldshaw Farm LLC. Number two, this is farming operations only. Number three, this is meant as a demonstration. This is not information being provided for investment purposes. Nor should you take these numbers as gospel if you're looking to start your own farm and you want to have some assumptions to work with.
This is just me sharing the information that I put together to the best of my ability to help show you guys what things look like. So please just keep all of that in mind. But when you start to unpack what that number looks like and what are the different pieces for our farm business, I think a couple of important things to note. Traditionally, I've tried to manage my farm as like different P&Ls. And so each of the different categories you see on the screen here represent a different P&L, whether it be trees or ducks or geese or chickens or pigs, which is gonna be a new one that I'll talk a little bit about, the cattle, value-added products, which are really anything that's a byproduct of my core farming practices, but then I put some extra work into it to turn it into something else. Like for example, I've got the first time ever the returns on our soap business, and I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. And then another major part of the overall farm business P&L is the content side of that, which includes YouTube, Meta, TikTok, merch, if I do sponsorships, and then the new one this year is also the book. All of that is kind of in the content business, which again, I don't consider part of farming operations, but if I look at my whole big business picture, it is a part of it as well. Now, one point I'm gonna make, and I'll talk more in depth about this as I go through this presentation, is as I start to look at these P&Ls, certain parts of it I'm going to start pulling out and not including as part of the farm operations. And the reason being, if I was making these decisions as a business just in and of itself, I wouldn't be doing them. So for example, I have never included beekeeping or maple syrup in my farm business operations. It's stuff that we produce here on the farm, but we really do it only at like a homestead scale production, and it's not really a business that we're doing. It's much more of a hobby activity. There's certain parts of my farm business that I've traditionally considered a core business P&L, but this year I'm no longer going to be including that. And so I want to get into what that means and what that looks like. But in terms of the full picture, this is it. So the first business I want to talk about is the tree business. The tree business has been something I've been doing for years now. It is a very small part of like the work hours that I put in on the farm, but in terms of an overall return, it's probably my most profitable product. You know, if I'm just tabulating my hours that I spend working on making trees every year, it's probably less than 20 hours worth of work overall. But in terms of the return, it is significant. So for 2023, I really focused on 3 different tree crops again: chestnut, black locust, and apple. The chestnuts are actually getting more expensive to produce because it's actually harder to find chestnut seed, but I still was able to sell 550 of them. In fact, I kind of screwed up a little bit and oversold. I actually shortchanged myself in terms of some of the trees that I've planted on the farm to be able to fill customer orders, which when it comes down to it is kind of why I'm not trying to scale this business up too much. I enjoy it. I sell the trees in bulk. I don't actually sell to anybody in orders less than 50 trees. So actually, if I look at it, over the course of 2023, I only had 8 clients who were buying trees from me, but they were buying large quantities of them. I was charging $9 for a chestnut tree and $6 for an apple tree, as well as a black locust tree. The apple and black locust, I mean, I'm basically producing it with stuff that I have here on the farm. So the price per tree from a production standpoint is actually very, very cheap and affordable and not a big problem at all. The chestnut, like I said, is getting more expensive to produce because more and more people are starting to grow chestnuts. In fact, I even have a little bit of a theory that my own videos have really kind of popularized how to sprout chestnuts very easily. And because I'm doing that, I actually think that that is hurting me because it's creating more competition for chestnut seed. But quite honestly, I think the world needs more chestnut trees, so I'm happy to keep promoting it. It just makes it a little bit harder to run that business. In terms of revenue, it generated almost $10,000 in revenue. And so in terms of gross profit that comes after subtracting out those costs, it's about $9,200, which I'm pretty proud of that number as well. The next big business that we have for ourselves and is a core part of our farming operations is the goose operation. You know, when it comes down to raising geese, we are really raising across the entire life cycle of the goose. We start by selling fertilized eggs in the spring, where this year we were selling 4 for $70 a piece. We would ship those out to folks, and that's basically kind of the business of that part of it. Then once I get into really April and May, I start hatching out goose eggs myself and I produce goslings. I'll sell live goslings to folks locally here when they hatch. I do not ship any birds. I'm not in that business at all. I don't have any interest in doing that. I know I get so many emails from people that I don't even respond at this point, from folks who are looking to buy live goslings. I don't do it unless you're gonna come to the farm. And so that's, you know, one nuance, but it does become a step in the process. And then I will also occasionally sell adult geese. In terms of the numbers of live birds that I sold though, it's not a lot. I did 15 goslings and 11 adult geese over the course of this year, but it is a part of the business. Then beyond selling the live geese, I also sell meat geese. What I'll do is I'll take all of the geese that hatched in the spring, and when they grow up in the fall, we basically have a slaughter day or 2 slaughter days, which is what we did here, where we, you know, harvest all of those birds, basically chill them down, put them in the freezer, and then a few weeks later, I sell them to folks. The way I sell the geese is basically you can put in a reservation over the course of the summer. So like in July, I usually open up reservations for buying geese. You put down a reservation deposit. That deposit pretty much covers my cost of raising the bird to adulthood and processing it. And so if somebody flakes out, I basically am left with a goose. I ultimately did 55 geese this year, which is the highest I've ever done. And, you know, I feel really good about that. Really, the only constraint I have is how many goslings I can hatch. The more I hatch, the more I sell. I sold out again this year. And then in terms of what those numbers look like, essentially, you know, the average revenue per bird was $139. And so it's like I took all 55 geese, added them up, then multiplied that by the price per pound. And that's ultimately what I came out with as kind of an average bird. You know, some birds I was selling for $80, some birds I was selling for $160. My weights were actually lower and more inconsistent this year relative to previous years. I actually think that because we had such a wet summer, even though I would have expected that to actually not affect things, it's the only thing I can chalk it up to, but I think that affected my weight per harvest. It was down a little bit on an average relative year over year. But when I look at that full picture, it was still relatively profitable because again, remember, geese are one of those animals that after about week 5 or 6, I'm not feeding geese at all. So I don't have food costs sunk into raising those geese into adulthood. What I essentially will have is, you know, basically early stage costs, then ultimately there's a really big cheap period, and then like the last 2 or 3 weeks I will start to feed them cracked corn to fatten them up. Next year I might experiment with feeding them a little bit more cracked corn to see what that does for my cost as well as my weights. But if my goal is to raise good birds that are raised in a very humane way, but then also raised in a very sustainable way, the more cracked corn I add into the mix, the less sustainable that bird is. And so it's definitely a balancing act I have to strike there. With the geese too, you'll notice that I actually raised more revenue with geese than I did with trees, but the trees are much more profitable because the expenses associated with geese are higher. You know, the biggest expenses include, you know, the cost of feed for the winter months. You know, I got a breeding flock of about 19, 20 birds. I have to pay to keep those guys going over the course of the winter. Then they start to produce. Then I also have to pay for feed for the young babies. I have electricity for incubation. I have infrastructure costs. Like, there's a variety of costs that go into it. Processing a goose is actually not all that cheap and is pretty labor intensive. And so kind of all of those things factor into what I ultimately have to do. The one upside I have that, like, say somebody who is, you know, buying geese from a hatchery and trying to do it as a meat business is, because I'm not bringing geese in at this point, or at least not in a significant way other than for genetic diversity, because I'm doing that, I actually save a lot in terms of cost per gosling. You know, I actually sell goslings from our farm at about $27 a clip. It's a little bit cheaper if you go through a hatchery, but not by much. And so that's one of the biggest ways that I make the goose meat business profitable for me. The other big contributor business that's kind of a new one for us this year was actually the value-added products. So we only did really 2 types of products this year. We did the feathers and we did the soap. The feathers are a byproduct of raising the geese, you know, basically just taking feathers from the geese, and I sell those. I ended up selling actually all of my feathers. So I actually sold 40 packs at $5 per pack, and I actually sold it at a cheaper price than I usually do, but I sold it all to one person. Alexa, what's 40 times 5?
40 times 5 is 200.
Okay, 200. So I sold 200 feathers. I don't really count the expenses of raising geese against that because it really would be something I just throw out. The packaging, collection, and sending of it is actually where my costs come into play for sending those feathers, and that's really the only part of my business that I have there. Now, one thing I forgot to mention when recording this video was that I had planned on actually selling duck and goose feet as dog treats. But unfortunately, as I went further down the road on that plan, you know, I had the duck and goose feet from harvesting my ducks and geese in previous years, but I looked at the cost of insurance, and particularly liability insurance, in case, I don't know, somebody's dog died from choking on one of my duck or goose feet. And the cost of that insurance made my estimated earnings from that activity to not make it worth my while. And so I opted not to do that. And I don't have any plans in the future to pursue that one. The bigger one this year that was actually much more important, new, and was kind of a carryover from last year. You guys might remember that I took the beef fat and beef tallow that I had from harvesting my steer Kurt Cobain last year, and back in January, I did a sale of soap. That soap ended up netting me about 275 bars. And ultimately that came to be about $1,300 in profit from selling that soap. And so that was a really nice little side business that I had where, you know, I basically just set up here in this kitchen and I rendered out all of the fat. Then I filtered it, then I mixed it with lye and I scented it and made bar after bar of soap. I really enjoyed doing that. And so the soap business is definitely gonna be something that we continue to do in the future. Now this year though, because I didn't harvest a steer, I'm not gonna have beef tallow, but I did harvest my pigs. And so I am gonna have pig lard that I can use to make the soap this year. And so I won't be producing it until probably January, and then it'll go on sale sometime in January-ish, maybe February. But this will be another business that we do again next year. And so you won't see the bottom line from the pig fat hit the business this year for 2023, but you will see it hit for 2024. Much like the 2022 beef fat is really hitting the bottom line with soap this year. And so I'm just gonna continue to be on like a cycle where I'm like a year behind, because making the soap is really good winter work, but it's not something I wanna try to do in the fall when I'm crazy with a lot of other things. Now, by the way, if you're hearing all of this and wondering, well, how do I find out when this stuff becomes available? The best way to do it is join our website's mailing list. So you just go to goldshawfarm.com and you'll notice there's like a little place where you can join the mailing list. Join that mailing list, because whenever I have like a new release, I usually make a blast out through that group first and foremost. And so usually that's the folks who are getting those products right out of the gate is when you're on our mailing list. Now, another business that has traditionally been a core part of our farm, and I would say if our farm is known for any one animal, it might actually be this animal, and that's the ducks. Where in 2023, it actually cost us $1,400 to raise actually both ducks and geese. And those costs, when you start to look at what the ducks and geese produce, have stopped making sense. And I'm going to be making a transition this year, or actually I should say I had made a transition, but when I'm looking at the numbers, this is gonna be something different than I did for 2022 in 2023. I used to do meat ducks and I used to do fertilized duck eggs. I didn't do either of those this year. I didn't do the meat ducks because I didn't have any male ducks to harvest. And I didn't do the fertilized duck eggs because it was starting to look like it's not worth my time. You know, going through and collecting duck eggs and packaging them and making sure that they're of quality that can be shipped as fertilized eggs, like all of that just takes a lot of work. And I was realizing that if I was gonna tackle something new like pigs, I was gonna have to scale back on something as well. And so I made the choice to scale back on that. I actually feel like it was the right decision, but what that's gonna mean is I'm no longer classifying either ducks or chickens as part of my core farm business, and I kind of put it more in the hobby category. You know, much like our garden, as well as the honey that we make, as well as the maple syrup that we make, like all of these things that sort of happen in the background and really either just give us at our household or maybe for some friends and families a supply of things. Like that's something that we will do, but it's just not a farm business like say the trees or the geese or the cattle. I'm no longer gonna classify each of them as part of the business, even though I am generating a little bit of money. When it comes down to it, I actually sold 7 ducklings this year. So if you guys remember, most of the ducklings that I had hatched died in the flood. The few that didn't, I'd actually just sold the day before to a couple of different folks. And so I sold 7 of them at $14 a piece. That ended up being nearly $100 in revenue. Then I also sold about 9 half dozen packs of duck eggs, as well as 18 dozen packs. Especially in the spring, I was pretty flush with duck eggs, but over the course of the summer too, I had all the crows eating into my profits and eating into all my eggs, which might also factor into a little bit of my thinking about like why I just don't want to treat this like a business anymore. And then when it came to the chicken eggs, you know, I sold 41 packs of dozen eggs at $5.50 a piece, and so that was about $225. But at the same time, it cost me about $1,400 to raise those birds. That's mostly feed costs. There's a little bit of infrastructure costs that are also in there. And the dilemma I have is this: if I was just purely running my farm like a business, and I was just purely making business decisions based off the P&L of the farm operations, I would just get all of the ducks, especially off my farm, and just say I don't want to do it. But number one, I really like raising ducks, and number two, I actually think a lot of the viewers of our videos appreciate seeing the ducks, and people would probably riot if I got rid of the ducks or even say like the weird chickens. And so keeping them around is a decision I make based on the unique nature of my farm, but I don't keep them as part of the P&L because then it kind of clouds the numbers. Where I actually probably lost about $1,000 raising each of those birds this year. But if I look at videos that featured the ducks and geese, I easily made more than that by having them in videos. And so again, it's that weird math of being both a content creator and a farmer that comes into play here, but I'm taking them out of the P&L because it just doesn't make sense from a farm business perspective anymore. I don't know, that might be very confusing for some folks. It might make other people mad to say, well, then that's not a real picture that you're giving us. But I don't know, guys, I'm just trying to do my best and like keep these numbers as clean as I can. You know, I do a very good job of tracking my numbers and my expenses over the course of every year. And so I have the data. How you want to interpret the data is kind of up to you as the operator or you as the viewer. It's kind of your call, however you want to think about it. But the bottom line is this: we're losing money on either of these. I would stop doing the ducks for sure. The chickens have this weird added benefit of they help with the cattle. On top of that, you know, we eat the duck and chicken eggs too, or at least Allison eats the duck eggs. I only can eat the chicken eggs because I'm allergic to the duck eggs. I essentially do a chargeback for any food that we're consuming that we produce that's part of our P&L. So for example, like we have a couple of geese in the freezer that we eat, like our Christmas dinner is gonna have a goose. Basically me, Morgan Gold, bought that goose from Goldshaw Farm. And so when it comes down to accounting for the food that we actually eat, that's the other way that I try to balance things out. So like I bought a lot of those 41 chicken egg packs that you see there. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And if I'm trying to just account for it all, that's how that shows up. The other area that I know I get a lot of questions about from the financials of, and I'm gonna try to dive in the best that I can for the first time on this one, is what does it look like with your cattle, and are they profitable, and how do you even keep all of that going? And so what I wanna actually share with you guys are some of the numbers that I have to date, as well as what the 7-year picture looks like. And when I was starting to make assumptions about what to invest in cattle, I did this exercise of creating a business case to say, how long would I do this? How long would it take to break even? What does that picture actually look like? And so I actually sketched out a 7-year picture back then. And over the last couple of years, I've gotten more data and numbers to say, here's what it's looking like, as well as getting a sense of some projections, and getting more data means better projections. And so that's what I want to share with you guys right now. So if I look at the first 3 years of raising cattle, here's what that picture looks like. For 2021, about $5,200 to buy my animals, about $1,300 in infrastructure, so mostly fencing reels and like water tubs and that sort of thing. About $320 in vet costs, $2,800 in hay, and all of that totaled up to about $9,600 in expense. And so that was just money out the door in the fall of 2021 that was really used to start up the cattle business. Then in 2022, it was still a losing year essentially. So I spent $3,100 more in stock costs. I also spent about $6,500 in infrastructure costs. Really was mostly fencing. And so the perimeter fence that you see on our upper pasture where the cattle spent pretty much the entire summer, that's part of it. The other thing is like the cattle panels that you see as part of our cattle yard for where they spend the winter. Year one, it was just like a bunch of T-posts and like just random fencing wire that I had around. Year two for the winter last year, I made the investment and I'm really glad I did. But that was another outlay of about, a couple $1,000s. And I also had about $1,100 in veterinary costs and about $3,500 in hay costs. But on the upside, I got about $5,100 in beef sales that came back in terms of revenue for me for last year when we harvested our first steer, Kurt Cobain. All in all though, I still had about $14,000 in expenses in 2022, but then it was down to about $5,100 in revenue. So it still netted out to another $9,000 loss. But by that point for year three now, which is this past year, it was very minimal in terms of infrastructure costs. It was also relatively cheap in terms of the hay, kind of stayed about the same, just slightly up. Then I did also sell Jimi Hendrix, and so that was a return as well. So that was $1,500 in the door. And I should also have noted this earlier, since we have had the cattle, we've had 5 animals born here on farm. So in 2022, we had 2 bull calves and 2 heifer calves. In 2023, we had 1 heifer calf. And so I'm growing my herd as well. And so this is where it gets very complicated to think about the business case behind cattle, because I have these animals that I can eventually sell for various values, which when I start to project out for 2024, this is where it starts to get really interesting. And now to keep these numbers straightforward and uncomplicated, I'm not making assumptions on buying new stock. I'm just letting this case sit right now with the existing stock I have. I am very, very likely to buy more animals. Right now, it's a little bit crazy with the Scottish Highland price of what an animal costs right now. And so I'm not rushing to buy to build my herd, but I will eventually buy more animals. And so even though for 2024, you see a 0 number for stock cost, there will be numbers associated with that to grow the herd, but then that's going to have an impact on the bottom line of the business case. And so again, without making it all convoluted and having way too many scenarios at play, I'm just leaving that at 0. But what you're going to see is, I have some basic assumptions around infrastructure and veterinary and hay that I'm just, assuming that it's going to be something like this. And I feel like these are pretty close numbers. I also expect to harvest another steer next year in the form of Joey Ramone. And so that's going to mean about $5,500 in revenue. And I will probably also sell the heifer calves that are born on the farm next year, because they're going to be the daughters of Macho Man. And I'm hoping that I get 5 animals born on the farm next year. And so assuming that, like, say 2 are female and 3 are male, the males are going to ultimately be castrated and raised as steers for beef in the future. Those females would be sold. Similarly for 2025, I'm going to plan to do that. And one thing you're going to start to notice too, if you look at the bottom line here, right? So in 2023, I am negative $4,700 on the year. In 2024, I'm actually projecting to be about $4,000 positive on the year. In 2025, I'm projecting to be about $500 positive on the year. And in 2026, it's going to be $13,000 positive and about the same for 2027. And so all in all, if I look at what things are going to look like, I will eventually turn a profit. So when you think about the shape of the cattle business here, it really does start with a lot of upfront costs. But then as you get momentum and you get scale in your business, a lot of those costs get defrayed. And so longer term, I really feel good about the cattle business. We're just getting through the tough part right now, if that makes any sense too. Again, I keep this kind of separate from my general farm P&L too, because unlike something like say the geese or the trees or even the pigs, you can't really think about it in just a 1-year cycle. I mean, even when it comes to harvesting a meat animal, you're looking at a couple of year window to go from birth to harvest. And so it's really hard to look at just a single year snapshot with the cattle as of right now. And so this is sort of just a new developing business that I keep off to the side. A lot of times when you look at corporations, they will often exclude those types of activities from their other core P&L because it's a growth business and they're just really making an investment for the future. Again, I know there's going to be some people who take issue with that, but I am just simply doing the best I can and trying to think about a very clean and simple way to think about my business, both profit and loss. And speaking of profit and loss, I did want to take some time to talk about the pigs. So as you guys recall, back in April, we added the first 3 pigs to our farm ever. It was the first time I'd ever raised pigs. I was doing it simply as an experiment, wanting to see if I liked working with the pigs, wanting to see if it was something that was a good fit for our farm, and wanting to just really learn a little bit more. Also, when I started raising the pigs, I wanted to see how much of the pigs' diet could be sourced from essentially free and found and recycling. And so most of their diet was actually coming from either vegetable scraps or apple drops or predominantly brewer's grains, so the spent grains from making beer. Now, I had planned to actually harvest the pigs here on farm in early October. Unfortunately, it was a very unseasonably warm October, which meant that I was ultimately pushing back my harvest date until early November. I brought my friend Cody on to really help me with the butchering and basically didn't go through a USDA or state inspected facility. Because I did that though, that means that I can't actually sell the pork that I produced. I can only eat it or have it for friends and family. It's like a non-commercial product. Now, I knew all of that going into my pig plan this year, and I just directly opted not to set harvest dates at a facility because again, I didn't want to have to try to sell a product I wasn't confident I was going to be able to produce and then have to meet that demand. I just wanted to do an experiment and basically fill our freezer as well as, you know, have some Christmas hams to give out to some relatives and that sort of thing. But that said, I was very, very focused on tracking my numbers. And as I tracked my numbers and really did some comparisons that I'll unpack for you in a minute here, it turns out that if I had actually gone the route of selling my pigs, I would have ended up with about $2,300 in gross profit over the course of 2023. Now, what you see here in this spreadsheet is kind of a view of all of my costs as well as some assumptions around cost and what that would look like. If I were to do a business where I was selling pork to people, I wouldn't necessarily do it where I'm selling like retail cuts of meat, like, oh, here, buy some ribs, and hey, have a ham, and here, have some sausage or some bacon. What I'd rather do is actually sell half or whole animals. And so like if you want to fill your freezer with half a pig, you would basically pay me a deposit at the beginning of the year, and then when I came to harvest the animals at the end of the year, you could then come pick it up and, you know, you basically get your meat and then you pay the remainder of the deposit based on the weight. I have some friends who have that business going already in the area, and so I asked them to give me some numbers, and so some of the assumptions that you're going to see in this spreadsheet come from that. So for example, they will typically sell a half a hog at $5.50 a pound. That's not necessarily the cheapest price, but it is a fair, reasonable price for a comparable product to what I raised. And so in terms of what does it look like for that number of what I would generate off the back of the pigs, you see all 6 of the half pigs. Remember, I raised 3 pigs. I would be selling these pigs as halves, and so that's what I did for this assumption. You know, their weights were respectively as hanging weights. So this is not total live weight, which is actually much higher, but the hanging weight was 148 pounds, 148 pounds, 143 pounds, 143 pounds, 139 pounds, 139 pounds. And so that was like across the 3 animals. When you split them each in half, I had, you know, actually I think that was Sweetie, I think that was Cutie, and I think that was Big Red at the slightly lighter animal. Then for me to buy a piglet, when I bought the piglets, it was $155 each, and so I just attribute that $77.50 for each half. Then in terms of feed, I spent $480 to feed my pigs this year. That is a crazy low number relative to what I got out of the weight. But again, that was because I was sourcing most of their feed from other places, like the pumpkins I grew on the farm I was feeding to my pigs, or collecting apple drops and feeding them to my pigs, or those brewer grains. All of those things cut my feed bill down so much so that really it only amounted to about $80 per half a pig for the allocation of that pig feed that I would end up buying at the feed store. I spent about $340 in the infrastructure that I needed to keep my pigs. So again, not all that expensive, but because this was year one, I needed to figure out how much was that gonna cost. And to set up their fencing as well as to set up their waterers and that sort of thing, it ended up amounting to about $340. The nice thing about that number is if I do pigs again next year, which I actually think the odds are relatively high that I do, pretty much absolutely everything related to that infrastructure this year can be carried over to next year. And so that will actually help make the business case look even better. Now, if I'm going to be selling these on a commercial basis, I would have to take them to a processor. For that processing, essentially you're gonna have to pay about $100 per animal for slaughter. And then I think it was like about 90 cents per pound of hanging weight for processing. So to make your different cuts of meat, that's what the slaughterhouse is gonna charge you. If I look at all of that, that's where there's basically a $140 processing cost per animal, ranges between $140, $130 per animal, plus that 100. So there is a couple $100 of expense to go from live animal to something that you can sell to somebody. But again, at $5.50 a pound and 148 pounds, for example, that's gonna end up being more than $800 that I'm gonna be able to sell, minus that $400 cost. And so ultimately, it leaves me with a profit for that first half pig that you see there of $409. That's pretty darn good. And overall, when you total up all 6 of those half pigs that I would be selling, that's where I get that $2,300 number. And so that is essentially my sample business case for the pigs. And after really thinking it over and talking with Allison, I would say that there is a 99% chance that we raise pigs next year. And probably what I'll be doing is selling half pigs, and I'll even probably be taking orders from you guys. And so again, get on our farm mailing list and you'll find out when I'm doing that. And if you'd be interested in coming to the farm and doing a farm tour and picking up your pork some point in the fall, that would be how the transaction would happen. And so stay tuned for that, but that will be a new business that gets added in here. But now I know you're all dying to know, how much money did the farm operations bring in given all of these random moving pieces? And again, I'm holding the cattle separate, I'm holding the pigs separate, I'm holding the ducks and chickens separate. And so our core operations really are focused on trees, geese, and the value-added products. And so if you're looking for the grand total of what did Goldshaw Farm operations produce in 2023, it ends up being $17,929.85. Given all the things that have gone on this year, I feel pretty good about. And if you're seeing all of that and saying, well, what does that translate into as an hourly wage? As I've said before, I try to track as much as I can. I do track my farm working hours, and based on the hours I put against those parts of the operation, it ends up being $14.36 as an hourly wage, which is above minimum wage, not by much. And I will say it's very hard to get somebody working at, say, a McDonald's for $15 an hour. And so I would say it'd be tough to get somebody to do this work at $15 an hour. And so that's why it's me, the farmer, doing that work, and that's what I'm making when I look at my farm operations. Here is what the last 6 years of farming have looked like at our farm. So we started in 2018 with a $180 profit. In 2019, that went up to $493. In 2021, we went up to $7,500. 2022 was $18,561. And 2023 ends up being $17,930. I feel pretty good about that. Some might say, whoa, you're down year over year to last year. But remember, I had the steer that I processed last year, plus I exited the duck business, so no duck meat, no duck eggs, that sort of thing. That actually took out some of my profit from last year. And then the other thing you've got to keep in... Oop. Hey, what's going on? Sorry, shooting a video. Sorry, I just got interrupted while shooting this video because I was just giving a friend of mine some pork. The way it works is they make salsa and beer, we make pork, and you give what you got to your friends. Now, I know the other piece of data that a lot of folks are gonna be wondering is how much money do you make from social media? You can't just be making that nearly $18,000 and that's what you use to pay for everything, and that's completely true. And as I've often said before, I make many, many times more from social media than I do from the actual farm operations, but those are numbers that I don't disclose. And the number one main reason why I don't disclose those numbers is because I think it puts me and my farm at a strategic disadvantage when I'm negotiating with a wide variety of sponsors and other companies. And so it just doesn't make sense for me to put those numbers out there. And so that's why I don't. But I do like to put the farming operation numbers out there because I don't have that same concern when it comes to those numbers. And I think it might help some people who are thinking about trying to do certain things like the things that we're doing on the farm. But again, as a big disclaimer, number one, don't just base it off the crap you hear me talk about in a single video. Really do your own research and really create your own assumptions. And then number two, these numbers are not meant to be the full picture of the farm business. And so you got to keep that in mind and recognize that there's certain things that you're not seeing and that you're not privy to that really shift how I think about things. Like, for example, I would not have ducks on my farm if I wasn't also able to subsidize those ducks with social media content. And so it's a weird set of decisions I have to make, but it's also one of the unique advantages of my farm. You know, other ways that this sort of idea manifests itself is, like, for example, I don't have to go to farmers markets to sell my products. I'm able to do it through my website because people see our videos and then they are the ones who often become our customers. That's unique to me. If I was running my farm business as only a farm business, I would be doing things differently. And so you got to keep that in mind. Now, if you want to learn more about the farm, I'll leave some videos over here. And when it's available, I'll also include that deep dive podcast and you guys can check that out. And I really can't wait to show you guys what we're able to do in 2024 and what the farm business looks like next year.